Hey guys. Happy Tuesday. A couple things at the top, then we'll get to your questions. As you guys know, Secretary Kerry is in Brussels today to participate in the Brussels Conference on Afghanistan. He, I think, has met with Afghan President Ashraf Ghani, as well as Afghan Chief Executive Abdullah Abdullah, to discuss a range of bilateral and as well as regional issues. The Brussels Conference on Afghanistan is bringing together more than 70 countries and 20 international organizations to endorse a reform program and reaffirm support to the Afghan government. At the conference, donors will outline their commitments to Afghanistan's development linked to continued Afghan progress on political and economic reforms. The conference sends a strong signal to the Afghan people and to the region that the international community remains committed to a stable and prosperous Afghanistan. And then just an update with regard to Hurricane Matthew. This morning, Hurricane Matthew made landfall in Haiti, bringing high winds and heavy rain along with it. It's too early to fully assess the scope of the damage, but we're continuing to closely monitor the storm's progress and assess initial damage. We have also already started mobilizing assistance to communities impacted, including providing $400,000 in initial relief assistance to Haiti and Jamaica. The U.S. Agency for International Development has deployed a disaster assistance response team, so-called DART, to the Central Caribbean. And the DART, which is an elite team of disaster experts, is coordinating with governments of the affected countries and humanitarian organizations who are already on the ground to bring vital humanitarian assistance and logistics support to those in need in the aftermath of the hurricane. The DART currently has experts in Haiti, Jamaica, and the Bahamas. The U.S. government is also communicating with officials in Cuba, Dominican Republic, as well as the Cayman Islands in order to coordinate relief efforts if requested. As mentioned yesterday, USAID's Office of U.S. Foreign Disaster Assistance strategically pre-positioned some emergency relief supplies in Haiti, and it's begun to prepare additional shipments of commodities from its emergency stockpiles in the region for rapid distribution to the thousands of impacted families. We'll work with international partners to distribute critical relief supplies, manage emergency shelters, and provide logistic support to humanitarian organizations. Also, just as a reminder, we issued a travel alert for Cuba in addition to the travel warning we issued over the weekend for Haiti, Jamaica, and the Bahamas. We continue to advise U.S. citizens in affected areas to make preparations immediately to shelter in place in a secure location and to follow the emergency instructions provided by local authorities. That's it. Matt?
Yeah, okay,
Sorry.
thank you. Just on that really
Yeah, please.
quickly, do you have in one place, can you, affected embassies, embassy closures, that kind of thing? Without having to look at each individual travel warning?
Yes. Hold on one second. Let me see if I can find that really quickly.
If you can't, it's fine, but.
So that's okay. No, so we've not evacuated any U.S. Embassy personnel. What we did is we enacted authorized departure via commercial airlines that was permitted for eligible family members in Kingston, in Nassau, and in Port-au-Prince. And some have departed, but the ambassadors and I would say critical staff remain in place.
Okay, thank you for that, but I'm
You're talking
asking
about-
more about, embassies that are gonna be closed for business, like, they can't.
We'll try to get an
help
update
people.
on that. Yeah, we'll just get an update with,
Thanks. And then I wanted to ask, on this?
No, Syria.
Yeah, Syria. So since it's now been a day since you guys have suspended the contact with the Russians on Syria, and there's been a lot of talk since then about what potential options you have for going forward. And I am wondering if there is any clarity yet about what is possible, what is likely, when a decision might be made.
Well, there's, excuse me, there's some clarity, not a tremendous amount of detail yet. Just to reiterate what Secretary Kerry said, just because we've temporarily or suspended the cooperation that we had bilaterally with Russia on Syria doesn't mean we've closed any doors with regard to multilateral action. And certainly, I think, we're examining closely our approach going forward. And in that regard, the interagency, the departments and agencies are discussing diplomatic, military, intelligence, and economic options. And we'll all have, these discussions going forward. But I think essentially our view remains the same. We walked away from this agreement that we reached with Russia with a certain degree of frustration and outrage and sadness, because we still think that agreement, had it been implemented, would have provided the best way forward, which is a political process and a political transition and a political solution. We still, the options going forward that are being considered, and we're looking at the range, but our stress is still on the political resolution.
Yeah, but it's, okay, well, I'm going to ask you,
Yep.
well, you can take, I know you're not going to answer this, but I'm going to ask anyway.
Yep.
What are the diplomatic, political, and intelligence options?
Well, again,
Didn't I
I'm not
say
going to.
military? Oh, diplomatic, military, and intelligence, sorry, not political. I couldn't read my writing.
It's okay. Look, I'm not going to get into the details. As we develop options going forward and look at what is reasonable, and again, this is not just about the U.S., but I want to stress the fact that we're going to work within the multilateral framework. We're going to work with other members of the ISSG. There's already a meeting, I think, that was announced by Germany tomorrow in Berlin that we'll participate in. But we're looking at a range of options, some of which we've talked about here from the podium before. But I don't want to preview or get in front of anything that hasn't been formally sussed out.
All of those options, multilateral options only, or are you considering some unilateral diplomatic, military, intelligence, and economic options?
So my answer to that is going to be that we always, I think, consider unilateral options when looking at a situation like Syria.
And you are now.
And we are now.
Yep. Thanks.
But as I said, we are also looking at, with the Russian channel with regard to Syria suspended, we're looking at how we can leverage and work with the other members of the ISSG.
And
Could
the
that
Secretary
include the
just
possibility of economic sanctions against Russian actors?
Again, I'm not going to close the door on any options. All things are being discussed, but I just
Expressed a preference for multilateral action, especially as regards sanctions, and you're meeting tomorrow with Europeans.
Well, we've talked about, I think, with respect to some of the legislation that's been proposed on the Hill, we've talked about the fact that regardless of where economic sanctions are applied, but with respect to, for example, Ukraine, that it helps to work in concert with like-minded partners and allies, as we did with respect
Will
to
you
Ukraine.
describe the people meeting in Berlin tomorrow as like-minded partners and allies?
Well, yes, you can look from the list of those attending. And again, I think this is just, in the wake of the inability for us to get this September 10th agreement, Geneva Agreement in place. It's a chance for us to get together with some of our closest partners on this to talk about the next steps.
Secretary Kerry's not attending that meeting in Berlin.
He's
He's
not.
flying back.
political directors, right?
There's
He's
been
not,
reported that he has meetings of the Principals Committee tomorrow at the White House.
I can't confirm that right now, but I can say that I believe it's going to be Tom Shannon who attends tomorrow's meeting in Berlin.
Marcus, what you, just
I'll
a
get
quick
you-
one on this.
Yeah,
What
please.
are you, the Secretary said we're not giving up on the Syrian people and we're not abandoning the pursuit of peace. So other than discussing options, what are you actually doing to pursue peace in Syria?
Well, again, I think there's always going to be ongoing discussions about the best way forward and looking at the various options. I mean, I'm not coming out here with anything to announce or anything to even really signal as a direction we may be headed. We're looking at a range of things to do. But I think what's important here is that there are other options out there. There are other players in this region, and we can work, we believe, in a multilateral way. We did so once before when the ISSG was first formed to get a cessation of hostilities in place. No one's underestimating, frankly, the challenge here, because when you've got what is, by any sense or definition, an ongoing assault on the people of Aleppo, that's going to be hard. But we're going to continue to pursue efforts.
Mark, I just want
I'll get to you.
follow up on a couple of things. You said that you have sadly and reluctantly, basically, walked away from the ceasefire. What was the one event, I mean, you've talked about this before, but could you tell us now, what was the one event
Yeah.
that basically made you walk away from this deal? Was it the bombing of the convoy? Was it the continuous bombing? What?
Well, I mean, it's hard to pinpoint one event. Certainly, the bombing of the humanitarian convoy after over a week of trying to get that convoy up and running and get it the access and the papers and all the documentation that it needed to get into Syria, only to have it bombed was demoralizing, to say the least, and an outrage. And we said as much. But then the fact that that was followed with, as I said, a full-on assault on Aleppo, it called into question, I think, the very feasibility or reality of a cessation of hostilities, or even what we had talked about, which was a 7-day suspension, or rather, not suspension, but a reduction in the level of violence. We had 2 or 3 days where we talked about there was a significant reduction in violence. And we talked about it at the time. There were violations on both sides. But then as you went into the weekend, I'm talking about the weekend before UNGA for the UN General Assembly, it really started to deteriorate.
So in terms of timeline, because the suspension happened
Yeah.
2 weeks after the bombing, it did not impact the
Well, we
walking
talked,
away.
I think, again, and Secretary spoke to this several times, we continue to talk to Russia about actions that we felt could be taken to reestablish the credibility of the process, and that didn't happen.
And Ambassador Turkin yesterday said basically that what sort of broke the ceasefire was the fact that you guys did not want to do something that you obligated yourself to, which is separation or separating, the terrorists from the moderate opposition.
Yeah.
Why is that such a daunting task? Why is that such a difficult thing to do?
Well, look, we've spoken to this many times.
Right.
It's a hard thing to do, given the circumstances, and it was only made harder by the fact that, many of these groups were under assault, under attack by the regime, aided and abetted by Russian air forces. It didn't make that piece of it any easier. But, that's an ongoing challenge.
But isn't it true, though, that these groups were mixed with one another, and in fact that made it easier
Well,
for
we've acknowledged
elements like Nusra to
Some.
move about and arm and regroup?
But I mean,
and so
some,
on?
and again, we've talked about the dynamic there and the fact that, there is that mixing of some members of the opposition, moderate opposition, with Nusra. Part of that, again, is exacerbated by the fact that when the regime attacks them, they're defending themselves, and frankly, as we've said many times before, it drives them into the arms of the extremists. Please, Kaya. I'll get to you, Michelle.
Secretary Kerry said the Syrian regime and Russia seem to have rejected diplomacy. On September 12th, they were on a diplomatic path. Then something happened. What do you think led to the failure of diplomacy?
Well, again, I think it was, we had a succession of events that led us to the conclusion that there was no viability to this process going forward. And you know this, everybody in this room knows that this wasn't a decision made in haste. There was a rough week at UN General Assembly, given some of the events on the ground in Syria, but we continue to keep that process going. But I think at a certain point, the decision was made. But the decision was made that we felt that the process couldn't go on as such.
Didn't it fail after some rebel groups, specifically al-Sham in Aleppo, used the ceasefire to strengthen their positions. Didn't it fail after ISIL nearly took over Deir ez-Zor following the U.S. bombing of the Syrian military, admittedly by mistake? Did those things play no role in the failure of that deal?
Well, again, I think, look, we've talked about this. There were a few good days of reduced violence in the beginning of the 7-day period. And then there was a series of events, certainly the attack by mistake on Syrian forces, but then followed by the attack on the humanitarian convoy, and then subsequently by an increase in attacks on civilian targets in Aleppo that were unconscionable, to say the least. And look, we can talk all about the fact that some rebel groups or some opposition groups may have used the pause to resupply. That's a reality, and that's something that the strategists looking at what was happening in Aleppo had taken into consideration. That was something that was worked out in great detail in the discussions we had prior to the September 10th agreement that we reached with Russia. We all knew the dynamics going into this, but we had to get through that 7-day period, and then we could have implemented the JIC, or the Joint Implementation Center. But we never got there. So you have to give this time, we had to give this time to really solidify. And we didn't, and we never got to the point where we could do that.
Just
One
a
more.
few more. Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, can I have 2 more, please?
Okay.
Thanks much. Suspending ties with Moscow over the failure of that deal, was it a diplomatic move or a political one, in your view?
Well, I mean, I think it was a diplomatic move, and I would just note that, and we've talked about this before, it was a suspension. We haven't permanently closed the door, but I think we would need to see something, some action by Russia or the regime or both, that really led us to believe that there was any reason to pursue it again.
I'm going to quote, so the Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman today was quoted as saying, and I would like to get your reaction to that, quote, "The whole time we were involved in these negotiations, in this peace process, we realized clearly that the U.S. did not have a joint position. Different structures and organizations in Washington had different views on what's going on in Syria. We were dealing with people who were changing their view and opinion every day. That was the main reason why they failed in fulfilling those agreements," end quote. Was everyone on the U.S. side on the same page when negotiating the deal?
So we've been very clear about how the interagency process works in Washington or in the United States. We think it's very effective, and it creates a single policy and a single path forward. But to get there, part of that, rightfully so, should always be a matter of debate and discussion with alternate viewpoints and alternate options being presented. But ultimately, it's the president who decides the way forward, and he makes the decisions as the commander-in-chief.
Just one more, please. How did Secretary
one.
Kerry specifically evolve on diplomacy in Syria? He was taped recently saying that he argued for use of force. How did he evolve?
I'm sorry, I missed the
So
how did he evolve?
How did Secretary Kerry evolve in his position on diplomacy in Syria? He was taped recently saying that he argued for use of force.
Well, first of all,
how did he evolve?
I'm not gonna speak to the fact that he was taped or his conversations that were private with members of the Syrian opposition. Look, Secretary Kerry has been very clear that he wants as robust a policy going forward to provide him the diplomatic leverage that he felt he needed in order to bring about a diplomatic process or a political transition in Syria.
Sorry, Mark, on your
Yeah,
answer,
it's okay.
your answer to the penultimate question there.
Yes,
You
sure.
said that the interagency process is very effective and designed, creates a single policy. Isn't the idea once the president makes up his mind and decides on the policy that the dissenters shut up and don't complain publicly about?
Precisely. I mean, that's
Did that
that's the
happen in this
commander-in-chief.
case?
Again, on a policy and an issue as like Syria, I mean, any given day, if there's different elements and different dynamics to be considered, and I think that
Okay.
that always goes into yes,
Did it create a single policy with no dissent?
yes.
Okay, it did, because there were a lot of people complaining about it.
I understand that there's
And not
I
not
understand that
secretly,
there's the
not
perception of that.
whispering in the background.
I understand that there's a perception of that,
That's,
but what I would say is that
doesn't that compromise the effectiveness of this
again, we carried out the policy that the president had dictated, that he wanted to pursue to the utmost degree that we could.
Mark, you talked about coordinating with the partners in the ISSG
Yep.
form. Russia is a member of the
They are.
ISSG. Will they attend the meeting tomorrow? And
Tomorrow's not, I mean, it's made up of members, but it's not an ISSG meeting. There is, I believe, just at the working level, an ISSG meeting in Geneva. I'm not sure whether Russia will take. I think so. I'll let the Germans speak to who's participating, but I believe that's
but
it.
Russia
Sorry.
will be there or not?
Tomorrow in Berlin? I don't believe so. But again, I'd refer you to the German. They're going to be, and I don't know whether there's going to be a working level ISSG meeting in Geneva, but that's a routine meeting, but those are ongoing.
Russia co-chairs the ISSG.
Correct.
And
Correct.
That means they should be there.
I'm just not going to speak to whether they're participating or not. I just don't know.
My second question is: news reports said that Russia has deployed for the first time S-300 on-time missile system to Syria, in addition to the S-400. Can you confirm these reports?
Don't know if we can confirm categorically or definitively yet, but we saw the announcement. Doesn't seem consistent with their stated goals, which are to counter extremists, as in ISIL and Al Qaeda, neither of which, last time I checked, have an air force.
What does it mean for you?
Our first goal is to protect U.S. interests, national security interests. We're going to continue to do that. We're going to continue to carry out our counter ISIL operations in Syria, and we're going to continue to protect our air forces, our air women and airmen as they carry out those missions.
Does it give you pause when you consider, let's say, maybe targeting Syrian targets in Syria and so on, Air Force targets, airplanes?
Again, I'm no
and so on,
military
by
expert.
air?
I'm no military expert, but
Because
given
these are obviously intended for, fighter aircrafts and jets and cruise missiles, as a matter of fact.
I won't challenge your assumption, but we haven't confirmed definitively. I haven't seen a Russian confirmation that they're actually deployed. What's that? They have confirmed?
the defense.
No, I haven't seen it.
Also said something like that. There's a missile called the S-23, which is designed for
Again, there are
to
these.
shoot down a cruise missile.
We note their deployment then, and and as I said, it seems inconsistent with their goals.
Is the U.S. going to be continuing doing what it's been doing in Syria, or is it waiting for a new strategy?
Well, I think so. Yes, in the sense that we're going to continue to carry out support for groups within the counter-ISIL, counter-Daesh coalition, those groups that are fighting in northern Syria to clear out, to destroy and degrade Daesh. We're also going to continue to carry out airstrikes. In fact, yesterday you saw that, as the Pentagon confirmed, there was a strike against a senior Al-Qaeda figure that was carried out. Again, it shows the fact that through our strikes, we're able to carry out very targeted strikes against senior leadership rather than wholesale hitting of areas that include civilian populations. But just in general, we're going to continue those operations full stop. And with regard to the way forward and the civil war in Syria, we're talking to like-minded allies, partners within the ISSG, and we're meeting internally as a government to plot out next steps.
What are requirements that it's looking for the next multilateral agreement? What are main stipulations?
Well, I mean, again, what we want is, we thought we were there with Russia, but what we want to see is a 7-day or cessation or a significant reduction in violence, a durable ceasefire, cessation of hostilities put in place, humanitarian access, which never happened during the last attempt to every place, but we would appreciate just some humanitarian access. And then, obviously, ultimately getting the political negotiations back up and running
Well,
in
what
Geneva.
leverage does the U.S. still have without Russia on its own to bring towards a multilateral agreement? Or any
Well,
kind of agreement?
look, I mean, it's, that's a fair question. I think, as we assess going forward, though, it's a matter of Russia being further isolated through its actions. You know, Russia has been in Syria actively for the past year. It said it was going after Al Qaeda and Nusra and Daesh rather. We haven't seen that to date, at least a concerted effort to do so. Frankly, it's been there primarily to aid the regime, but it hasn't built a broad coalition. It hasn't, frankly, built much support at all. It's only isolated itself on the international stage because of its actions, which include carrying out airstrikes against civilian centers, civilian populations, hospitals, and other civilian targets.
So if Russia was involved in another
Last question.
multilateral agreement, what precautions would you make Russia take before entering into a multilateral
I can't
agreement?
predict. I mean, I can give you broad strokes what those might be. One includes, ceasing to carry out strikes against civilian populations. And then also what we wanted to see at the end of last week was the regime grounding its air force.
I just want
Please.
to follow up on something that you said a year ago. Russia began its involvement in Syria.
Intensified.
No, they began on the 30th of September last year, so it's been a year. Yesterday, Mr. Turkin said if it hadn't been for Russia's interference, Damascus today would be in the hands of Daesh. Do you have any comment on that?
That's a common narrative that the Russians put forward.
You don't believe that? I mean,
Look, I reject that, and we reject that, because, while everyone recognized for the past year or before that, but it was one of the primary tenets of the ISSG when it formed was the fact that you needed to, in some way, shape, or form, retain some of the infrastructure, some of the institutions of the Syrian government as you went forward or moved forward with a political transition. Assad is not a future leader of that country. He can never be. Please.
Yeah, Turkey has been a major supporter of the Syrian opposition. It's a member of the IISG. And Vladimir Putin will visit Turkey next week for the World Energy Conference, and he will meet with President Erdogan. Will any senior U.S. officials be at the conference? And if so, will they meet with the Russians? If not, has Turkey provided you any information on what Erdogan might be saying to Putin? And is there things you'd like him to be saying?
We, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. We consult closely with Turkey on Syria all the time, continuously. I'm sure we'll be consulting in the run up to this meeting next week. And after that, Turkey has played an increasingly helpful role, especially in the operations around their borders, trying to clear out some of the borders and also permitting the counter-ISIL coalition to use Incirlik Air Base. I understand this visit by Putin was long planned. I can't speak to what level or actually who among the U.S. government who might be at this conference. I just don't have that information yet.
Would you expect Erdogan to speak very harshly to Putin about what the Russians have done in Syria?
Honestly, I can't predict what he may discuss with President Putin.
Mark, I have to leave.
Yeah, please. Of course.
One very brief, it's off topic, but if Tom Shannon is going to Berlin for this, he was supposed to go to Venezuela, was he not this week? Is that still is that happening?
I believe so. I'm not
Has it been postponed?
sure that was ever announced, but he's definitely attending Berlin. So he's not going to Venezuela. We can change topic.
can we go to the Palestinian-Israeli issue?
Sure, and then I'll get to you.
Okay. Yesterday, I asked Elizabeth on the demolition of homes
Yep.
in East Jerusalem, and she responded by saying that, she stated your position, but also said that you call on both parties to reduce tension. I mean, in this particular case, what could the Palestinians do? What would be their part in this aspect, in
Yeah.
the home demolition?
I mean, look, I think I know she was speaking broadly about not necessarily to the specific issue or topic of demolitions, but we're talking about the general environment, which is not conducive to creating the kinds of conditions we need to see in order to get some kind of peace plan back on
To do
track.
with incitement or anything. The Israelis claim that the Palestinians do not give the proper permits, which they never give them a proper permit. And these Palestinian families grow. I mean, they have large numbers and so on, so they need to expand, which they never get. What should they do?
Well, again, I think we remain concerned about.
Should people be able to build in their own homes and expand to accommodate their other members of the family and so on?
I think we've talked about this before, Said. Certainly. That said, anyone in the United States, I know, if they want to put on an addition to their house or do some work or expand their house, they need to get proper permits. That's part of having a legal system in place. But that said, there should be a way. But there should be a way for them to do so.
So is Israel within its legal right
I
to do
apologize.
that? Is Israel within its legal right to deny, to continue to deny
I
that?
frankly don't have enough detail on what their claims are and what their counterclaims. I think we're just concerned that we have seen an accelerated rate of demolitions recently, and anytime we see that, we believe that it's not helpful to the overall climate that we think needs to be in place in order for talks to get started.
I have just a couple more.
Please.
Isn't it particularly cruel to have people demolish their own homes? As the alternative to that would be just huge sums of money that they must pay the occupation authorities.
Again, we're concerned by what we've seen. We share those concerns with the Israeli government. I'll leave it there.
And let me ask you one more thing about the women's boat that is, getting ready to dock in Gaza in a couple of days. They're calling on, they're calling on you, they're calling on the international community and so on to press upon Israel not to intercept by force the boat. Would you call on Israel not to intercept by force this boat?
Sure. This is the all-women
Yes.
Gaza flotilla. So while we underscore the need for international support for Gaza and its recovery, we do call attention. The Department of State does have a travel warning in place for Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza, and our longstanding recommendation is that U.S. citizens stay out of Gaza entirely due to those concerns. I think in this particular case, we would hope that the boat operators heed the instructions of Israeli authorities in order to best ensure the safety and security of the people on board the boat. And I would also just add to that there are other ways to get assistance into Gaza that are accepted and authorized by the Israeli government.
How would you end this siege? How should the Gaza siege end? Because it has gone on for far too long. How should it end? And when should it end?
Well, I mean, certainly we'd like to see it ended, as soon as possible. But that takes both sides, and certainly by both sides, I mean that the Israelis need to be assured that tunneling and other security threats that are currently posed by some of those who live in Gaza to the citizens of Israel need to end. Yes, sir.
What Kirby has said in Brussels and Josh Earnest has said from the podium at the White House on Mr. Duterte's latest comments that they're at odds with a warm relationship and that you haven't had any formal communications about altering the bilateral relationship.
I don't have much to add to that. I mean, again, I thought he put it very well, which is say, we've spoken to this kind of rhetoric, and it's at odds with the relationship we feel like we have with the Philippine people and with the Philippine government. And we have not seen any real diminution in that relationship. So, recognizing that we're a treaty ally of the Philippines, and also that we have this strong cultural bond, people-to-people bond, we're going to continue.
See why we ask you about this
I
every
understand.
day.
Yes,
I mean, it's the head of state.
I understand.
Are there any other countries in the world where the head of state talks that way, where you don't see any change in the relationship?
Again, that's
What do
really
you have to say, or would you have to write it down and post it to you with a stamp on it?
no. Look, I mean, no one's giving any head of state a free pass on unhelpful rhetoric. But I think what's important is that any bilateral relationship be seen in the broader context. And by broader context, I mean the fact that we have had and continue to have good, solid cooperation and productive cooperation with Philippines on a number of levels. And we're going to continue to pursue that. We're not going to, walk away.
Can the U.S.-Philippine relationship withstand this kind of rhetoric for the rest of President Duterte's term? I mean, he's been in office 3 months and change, right? He's sworn at the U.S. president twice. He said that the military exercises that I think are beginning today will be the last ones, although the foreign minister then said, well, no, the ones in 2017 are going to happen. I mean, can you keep your upper lip this stiff for another 5 years or however many years it is?
I'll just say in response that the United States is going to live up to its commitments and is going to continue to move forward with this relationship. I can't speak on his behalf.
Mark, you described this as unhelpful rhetoric, but I'd like to get you to specifically respond to a quote from, this was the second speech of the day after the go to hell remark, where he says, I would be reconfiguring my foreign policy. Eventually in my time, I would break up with America. I would rather go to Russia or to China. Even though we don't agree with the ideology, they have respect for the people. Can you give us a specific response to that type of comment?
I do not want to get into a tit for tat with President Duterte. I would simply say that we have a very strong bilateral relationship and a very strong people-to-people relationship. And I think if you asked any Filipino citizen, they would say that same thing.
But they voted this guy into office.
Mark, you talked about previously that relationships are not a zero-sum game, that you don't mind that the Philippines would be getting closer to China or Russia, but
Yeah.
does that extend to arms sales as well?
Again, I'm not aware of what they may be talking about with Russia or China, but it's not, we're not trying to make this an either-or proposition. We value our relations with the Philippines. They're a strong ally, strong partner in the region. Again, we've had decades of strong relations with the Philippines. We've had each other's backs, and we want to continue that cooperation going forward. Public comments, rhetoric aside, we believe that the foundation still exists for that relationship to continue and strengthen.
You don't have a problem with...
I've got a lot of patience.
So
Is
you,
that
so you
a
don't have a,
legitimate foreign policy and security policy, or is it some sort of...
I'm sorry?
Is he being a vigilante, or is he conducting
I'm
himself?
not gonna
No, I'm
comment
saying,
on-
how would you
yeah.
describe his security and foreign policy?
Again, I think he may in fact still be forming his policies going forward. He's only been in office a few months, as someone just reminded me. I'm not going to speak to the course he may take. All I can speak to is the current state of our relations, and government to government, people to people, they remain strong.
It sounds like he just wants you to stop criticizing his plan to kill all the drug addicts and traffickers.
Well, look, we're never going to give, whenever we see or hear of credible allegations of human rights abuses, we're never going to give that a pass.
Well,
That I will.
I'll get tomorrow then.
I mean-
but, yeah.
That it, guys? Thanks.